This presentation is made possible by the American Baptist Churches of New York State, funded in part by the congregations who support the ABCNYS region offering. Thank you. Well, good evening and welcome to this conversation about part-time ministry and shared pastors. It's a growing need among our churches in upstate New York and really around the country. It is a different and challenging day, but as you'll learn in these series, some churches have been doing this for a long time, and other churches are just beginning to consider what it looks like to be in part-time ministry. I'm Jared Huguenot. I serve as the Associate Executive Minister of the American Baptist Churches of New York State. And so out of a sabbatical leave last summer, I took some of that time to work through issues of part-time ministry and shared pastors because, again, those are living questions that we deal with day in and day out as an American Baptist region. So tonight will be part one, and then part two will be next week at 7 o'clock, Thursday, February 8th. We'll be talking a little bit more in depth about what happens when a pastor is shared between two pastors. And then the third week on February 15th will be an opportunity to explore what part-time and shared ministry is from the perspective of pastors who are actually doing that right now. So we have two part-time pastors and two pastors who are shared between two churches, and they're going to come and be the panelists and share with you their experiences and answer out of their experience your questions. And so I hope you'll join us for that. I have a very interesting panel put together from pastors around our big upstate New York region. It's important to remember that as American Baptists, we do depend on your contributions. And for those of you who are here as part of the region, remember that the region offering is underway for 2024. This year, we are encouraging our churches to share the good word, that when we share, we can do good together. And so materials about the 2024 region offering are going out of the office here in the next day or so and to your mailbox. And region offering materials and video are available right now at the region's web page, as well as the videos will appear on our Facebook page. And so we hope that you will find a moment in your worship time to share one of these videos and to encourage your church to support the region and cite this very program series as a reason that the region funding the churches give does make a difference. Thank you. The American Baptist Churches of New York State comprise 267 churches. We cover the bulk of upstate New York. We have our sister regions in Rochester and Metro New York, but we have a good tract of land to cover. And with that, 267 churches scattered across the state as they are, we also have to be, as region staff, the bearers of good news, which is you are not alone. And never get tired of saying that because I think it's important to reinforce you are not alone. You have sister churches in ministry together. But yet we, and our local church that we know and love best, we sometimes tend to think about what's right in front of us. And so it is helpful that when Jim Kelsey or myself or Steve Reynolds, who assists in some parts of the state, talking to search committees, we share that the average American Baptist church in upstate New York is served by a part-time pastor. So 267 churches, about 60% or more, are served by part-time clergy. And that is a surprise to our search committees. Sometimes they know they need a part-time pastor, but they don't realize how prevalent other churches have need of a part-time pastor. And so I think this has all happened as time has gone on, and we have encountered these challenges little by little. And so yet as we go through this presentation, we will realize that we are in good company we're not alone, and times have changed no matter who we are or where we are. How we got to today is, I think, an important piece of this presentation because, again, we have to think in common, how do these issues affect our churches? One of the biggest things that I think churches around the region would say is they do have a sense of struggle in general with the issues of attendance, building, and cash. Those three things, I think, are sources of concern, sometimes sources of anxiety. Our numbers are down, our giving is down. Our building just got another big bill handed to it because we've had deferred maintenance, old age issues in our buildings, and the buildings have not magically shrunk as our congregation numbers have. And certainly our utility bills go up. And so we are kind of in this time of struggle where we know that money is finite. The church, you could say, is living often on a fixed income. The money that comes in every month for many of our churches is the money we have to work with. Some churches even have endowments, but still find themselves not able to keep up with 2024 prices. So it is a challenging time. Also, we live in a time where pastoral ministry is very much shaped by the communities we live in. In so many parts of upstate New York, you can tell the story of your communities based on, how employment and workforce contracted and expanded as new businesses came in or businesses left. And so I think it's no great surprise that it's safe to say that our churches do reflect the economic conditions that they are in. And so if your community is struggling, very likely your church is also having some financial challenges. And so pastoral budgets do have some correlation to the effect of community economics. Part-time pastors have existed. They're not just something that's new. I mean, even Paul himself talked about being a tent maker, somebody who had a side hustle, a side gig, another job. And in fact, a lot of our pastors today would say they could be bivocational, but we found the more helpful language is to say so many of our pastors are pastors who need multiple sources of income. And by that, we mean how many W-2s do you have on April 15th? Well, for some pastors, it can be just the one they get from the church, but for most of our pastors, it could be multiple sources of income, or they've retired and they can, have their pension and Medicare and other things that help supplement what the church is not able to come up with. And so we do have pastors again who serve, and they may even choose to serve closer to full time, but for all intents and purposes, the percentage of the income that they have to live on is not coming from the church. And so for so many of our congregations, we need to talk about this idea of multi-income pastors and kind of reshape our expectations of what sort of time commitment those pastors have. When I started this job, it became very apparent that it might be helpful to say that we need to talk about money in church. I know money in church, that's always a fraught subject, but if we talk about it, maybe it becomes less fraught. And so we have dollars that we have to be dealing with, and we also have the duties of that pastor. And so if you can find a balance between the dollars, which may be fixed, as I said earlier, by certain economic realities, you also need to adjust the duties so the scales continue to balance rather than become lopsided. A lot of times, clergy will say, well, I know I'm being paid part-time, but I'm expected by my church members to work full-time. And we have to really be honest with each other in churches that that day of over expecting the pastor needs to come to an end. We are calling human beings to be our pastors. And if they have a second job, a third job, they have a second church, we need to kind of figure out how the church dynamic works where the pastor is not burning themselves out. One thing I say is it's one thing to call a new pastor, it's quite another to retain that pastor. And everybody wants their pastor to stay. So consider this conversation and this series ways to help you have long-term pastors who happen to be serving part-time or shared. It's a good investment that you're here tonight for your church. Again, another piece that we have to remind ourselves is we are Baptists, and we have been known to be reactive. I know you might be, I can't see all of you at this point in the program, but I'm sure you're all clutching and saying, oh no, Baptists are reactive. I never knew. Well, Baptists can be reactive because we're human beings, but we also have, I think, a tradition that lends itself to react more than it reflects. And so I am very hopeful that if I can promote anything, that you will use some of the tools we're talking about in these presentations to help your church calm down and to be part of good conversations that will help us have long-term benefit, such as finding and retaining a pastor and having a good balance with pastor congregation collaborative ministry. So we're going to talk about that. So again, this question of part-time is sufficient. Again, there are some skeptics. Is part-time plenty? Really? There was a book that was published in 2020 called Part-Time is Plenty, where we got the name for this slide. And the subtitle is Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy. Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy. The fellow who wrote this book researched 20 churches across ecumenical lines for what is the DNA that helps congregations really thrive and still have a part-time pastor. This book was very helpful. We developed a program in October of 2021. Steve Reynolds, who's with us tonight, was the presenter, and he presented on the content of this book while also contextualizing it to the issues of New York State American Baptist challenges. All of that content and more about this book are on our website. If you go to abc-nys.org and then you click the Ministries tab, there'll be a drop down, and it is a little piece called Ministry in Upstate New York, and you'll find these type of presentations, more about this book, and Steve's video presentations from 2021 as well. Because we still want to make sure our churches are talking about this and refreshing the conversation. And so again, we have content. We hope you'll use it. Now, in my work on sabbatical in this past year, I wanted to think, well, if we're going to talk about shared pastors and part-time pastors, there are some things underneath the surface that I think we would benefit from talking about because we are American Baptist congregations. And so here are 4 areas that I'll cover tonight in this presentation. We're going to talk about the experience of local church autonomy and what it means to be an American Baptist congregation. Where does the buck stop? We're going to talk about church communication skills. We're going to talk about adaptation of how the pastor might be understood in the context of the whole ministry of the church. How could we be more collaborative than pastor dependent? And then a little reminder that next week we'll come back and talk about the more new, shall we say, phenomena of American Baptist churches who share a pastor. Now, again, because this is a short form presentation, I'm not going to go exhaustively into some of my thoughts on the matter. However, this guide that you've been provided, and that can also be downloaded from our region website, is here. And so more in-depth talk about these 4 talking points will await you within this document that I've written. Moving on, congregational autonomy and responsibility. Each and every American Baptist church is autonomous. In other words, independent. In other words, self-governing. In other words, it's all in the hands of the local church to make big picture decisions. And big picture decisions can include the annual meeting of the church, the budget of the church, the hiring of a pastor, the setting of the pastoral budget, hopefully not the termination of a pastor, but all of those issues that are big picture issues that affect the well-being and the identity and the furtherance of the congregation have to be a matter of discernment and vote by a duly called meeting, duly warned meeting of the congregation. And so that's where the buck stops, is with, well, the local church. Well, it stops with the body of the church, the members, you. So if we are going to say anything about how to have a healthy part-time pastor relationship, or deciding to share with another congregation, a pastor, we do need to have a very responsible sense of, well, we are responsible for making this work. And so in some ways, autonomy, which we do love in this tradition, comes with freedom, lots and lots of freedom, glory, hallelujah. It also comes with responsibility. And so moving on, communication is going to be part of that effort. Uh, Churches do really well when they go through a pastoral transition if everybody in the congregation is kept reasonably informed about where things are in general. Now, I know a search committee does need some elements of confidentiality and keeping some things not broadly known. Uh, but at the same time, they have the responsibility to keep feeding back to the congregation where things are, to be in conversation with the other boards, particularly when it pertains to setting a pastoral budget. Setting the expectations of a pastor is also something that ought to be talked about up front. And so churches do good work when they communicate well. One thing that I've noticed that, again, doesn't sound like rocket science, but I want to stress it here. Baptists do very well when they have big decision conversations, big meetings, while they also have some potluck. Food does help the Baptist talk. Food helps fellowship. Fellowship helps a healthy conversation, which might lead to a non-acrimonious church meeting. Glory, hallelujah, the true goal. Now, one thing about informed congregations is also going to be the issue, and I talk more at length in my guide about this. Uh, you're going to have to talk about big picture things, such as, well, where is the money that we have to work with going? And I think increasingly churches need to couple their pastor transitions with conversations about other big picture issues. How is the church doing? How is our building holding up? What are some things we need to put more resources into to make the church improve? And one model has been to take your expense budget, the side of the church budget where you see where the money went, and taking out the money that you give to missions, because that's important, but it's also money that the church receives and then sends out the door to various mission partners, including hopefully your region. You put that money to the side. It's there, it's good, but it also can't stay. But look at the money that you're spending on everything else. That's your expense budget. You're spending money on a pastor. And if you have other people on staff, personnel, pastor and personnel, you have the cost of the programming of the church, how you do discipleship and make the church lively. And then you have, of course, the building. However, in the thinking of one church consultant that I think is quite bankable, most churches, in his opinion, do best when they are spending 50% of their expenses on people, the cost of the pastoral budget, any other staff you might have. 50% of your expenses ought to be spent there. 25% ought to be spent on programming, the things that make the church go. Now, I'm getting to the building, but often when I share this, people know how to do math. 50% plus 25%. Oh, you mean we should be spending no more than 25% on our building? Now, again, it's not a perfect thing, but I think it does help as an exercise that, yeah, you need to really have an idea of how much money you're spending on the building, and are you comfortable with that? There might be times where our churches need to say, is our building starting to uh, pull down the rest of the church? Is the building becoming a liability? And honestly, I have a lot of churches who will say, well, wait, let me just tell you, I know without even looking at the expenses and doing the math, we spend over 50% of our income paying for this building. Well, I think churches have to start wrestling with that issue. Is the building our only ministry? I run a group here in this region about that issue. How do we keep the building earning its keep, not the church trying to prop up the building and then, well, less and less money is put into everything else. And I have had experiences where, honestly, it's cut and cut and cut the money available to have a pastor. So you're keeping a huge building going, but a very small portion of money for having a pastor. And so you have to kind of wrestle with that. What are your priorities going to be? What are your choices going to be? And maybe do you need to revisit those things? At this point in the life of the Christian church in North America, I think the best thing is not a church leadership book. They can be handy. It might be an Etch-a-Sketch, because we really do need at times to have the freedom to do this and try to redraw, if you will, a new understanding of what is, that also is aware that someday somebody else is going to say, hey, it's time to shake the Etch-a-Sketch again and do some redrawing. We have our past, we have our present, but we also have to have something for our future. And so I'm hopeful that as you have these conversations, that it's not just repeating year after year the same old thing, but you do look for ways to kind of break the monotony, break the ruts, and find ways to have conversations that do lead us back to core principles, which is proclaiming the love of God and the salvation through Jesus Christ. We need to have more energy for that. And so I think these sort of questions may be tough to wrestle with, but they will lead hopefully to being more productive for the sake of the gospel. Uh, in addition to communicating concepts and getting people to talk to each other, it's maybe time to adapt. And being adaptive is a form of being reflective. Adaptive is also countering the impulse that comes with being reactive. A lot of our churches historically have had pastor-centric models for ministry, in that ministry has been more about, if the pastor isn't present, ministry isn't getting done. That day will probably continue in some churches, but I would hope that in our churches, we look at how do we collaborate with our pastors. And especially as we call part-time pastors who can't be there 20 hours or more a week. And that's a very lived reality for our churches. And they have to have other jobs, that the ministry is reconfigured to be more collaborative. So other people help out and volunteer and take up little pieces of things that then the pastor is free to do the core things you've called that pastor to do. One of the best experiences I've had in my ministry was in my first church. I was called to a church 15 hours a week. And at that church, I was there 15 hours a week. I was working 40 hours a week in a full-time job, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And I got a call one day in my first few months as the new pastor, and they said, well, so and so has gone into the hospital and is going to have surgery. It was very unexpected. And uh, we also know you're going to be busy until 5 o'clock. So don't worry. We'll go over and check in as the day goes on with so and so. But as you can, after you're done for the day, could you go over and check on her too? I thought that was very kind. And I share that story with people because, again, it models that sort of understanding that the ministry is done by the whole people of God, that we share. And we also understand the pastor can only be at one place at one time. They're our fellow human beings. So that collaborative spirit, I think, will help lead to greater ministry, pastoral longevity and retention. But it'll also, I think, help you feel more connected to your congregants. Because I think there's something wonderful about more than one person coming to say at your bedside, the church cares for you. Let's expand and share the ministry that way. Lay ministry is growing. Our region has a lay study program. Some of you on this call have availed yourselves of our programming and hope that you will continue to share in your churches about the benefits of the region lay study program. And certainly, region staff is glad to come and talk as a part of a visit. And we encourage you to share brochures because, again, some people use that as a way of doing their theological training to become a pastor. And others, they just become more enriched and empowered to carry out different aspects of ministry as a more well-rounded lay leader. And so we do provide ways as a region to help your church and your individual congregants study up and level up in their skill sets to help do the ministry of the church. The other piece, and again, more in depth in the guide, is the reality that as we look at the pastor's duties, some of our churches may have maybe 15 hours at best of funds available. And so it might be helpful to start thinking about, well, if we want the pastor to do worship every week, if they're full-time or if they're quarter-time, no matter who you are, every pastor who has a Sunday morning every Sunday. Did you know they came every Sunday? That was very disappointing to learn after seminary. I found out that, every Sunday I had to take about 10 hours a week to do the work that goes into preparing a sermon, writing, being creative, also working on the bulletin, any logistics about coordinating music and prayers and getting all that stuff figured out. And then on Sunday morning, the worship hour, I was there probably 3 hours from beginning to end with the worship service in the middle because it was good to be there about an hour ahead. And it usually was about an hour after the Amen that I actually went to lunch. So 10 hours a week is a good rubric to keep in mind that when you're talking about hiring a part-time pastor, that rain or shine, unless you have a very unique situation where you don't want your pastor to preach every week, you really do need to factor 10 hours, rain or shine, are going to be used for the ministry of preaching and leading worship. So that does sometimes reshape people's understandings, but they just didn't have that sort of quantifiable understanding. And so I think some of our part-time pastors have benefited since we've started sharing that sort of insight with our churches, that 10 hours a week right off the top, Sunday morning purposes. And the other thing I would say is to also be very scrupulous about not getting into that old joke that this is my job description, and then there's other duties as required, which is usually a catch-all for I do a lot of other stuff that's not in the job description. We really have to be careful with part-time pastors that written or unwritten list of other duties as required doesn't just keep creeping and creeping and creeping until they might as well be working full time for part-time pay. So again, it's about balance. It's about finding collaboration, and it's about communicating and being realistic with each other in the life of the church. Um, in conclusion, I think if anything, remember, ministry can happen when there's not an ordained person in the room. Ministry can happen. And part of our goal as a pastor should be to help multiply and train people for ministry, to encourage people for ministry. But we also need people to say, yes, I would like to use my gifts in service to the church. And so we also need to be brave and say, we do this as a congregation with a part-time pastor. And this is what we don't do anymore because we have a part-time pastor and because we ourselves can't do it. There are going to be some things that you just need to bless and let go. And I think the more we talk about that, the more we actually start saying it's okay to let something go. And I found that when something's let go in a congregation that felt burdensome, that really wasn't needed, it feels really good to let something go. And just a little insight here, not rocket science, but having a future means that we work toward the future we want today. We have to plant a tree to enjoy a tree in 20 years. Uh, 20 years ago. We have to make that investment and be content with the fact that not everything will be immediately paying off. We may not even live to see the dividends of some of the things we work for, but that's okay. We need to work towards a future where our church continues to thrive, that our pastors are able to serve as they can, and not to bear too much undue burden in the work of ministry. And so, with that, this is the first part of our presentation, and we're going to turn now to some discussion time. Just a moment as I stop things here. Okay, well, you're all awake, so that's a good sign. And so, as we've talked tonight, through some of these issues. We are going to be recording this part. And so, if you're comfortable asking a question that might be seen later on the internet, we do appreciate you raising those questions in good spirit here. So if you're comfortable using the little hand signal thing, there is a way you can raise an animated hand if you have a question. And some of us know our way around Zoom. Other people, because we have enough people here tonight, I can't see everyone on my same screen, but I would suggest that you just kind of wave or then speak up if I haven't become aware that you're wanting to talk. So who has our first question tonight? Just open your mic and talk. Questions this evening?
I'll start. So, are there people on the call right now or on this Zoom that are part-time and would like to share their pluses, their challenges, their successes?
Okay, I saw Alika raise a hand. Anyone else? Joanne Dewing and John Helgeson. Now, John is special. Well, he is special. He's a good man. He's being shared by two churches in the region. He's also Presbyterian, so he does like putting up with Baptist twice on a Sunday morning. He wins a prize. And then, was there anyone else who wanted that I haven't named? Okay, Phil Pratt out there in the Chautauqua Association. So, Alika, and then, ooh, help me here, Alika, and then uh, John, and then sorry, I'm just blanking. Joanne. We'll start with you three. So go ahead in that order, please.
So I was in Orleans County, the WeGo Association, working at First Baptist Church in Albion as a solo pastor, my first call out of seminary. It worked beautifully because I knew the community, and I was fully aware of the economic situation going into it. Luckily, my spouse covered most of our living expenses, but I also picked up a part-time job at our local hospice. So I was 15 to 18 hours a week at the church and about 20 hours a week at the local hospice, about 20 to 25 hours a week at our family business, and single parenting with a working spouse through all of that. So, when you talk about where you spend your money and where you spend your time reveals your priorities. Looking back on it, there were things that were priorities in my heart that were not actually priorities with my time, unfortunately. So that was a drawback. But I really liked the flexibility. I was glad when Jared said you need to plan 10 hours a week right off the top for worship planning, because after a few months, I realized that's how long it really takes just to do Sunday. And gratefully, my church was comfortable with my only having an additional 5 hours to give them for pastoral care or meetings or, different events at the church. But like I said, it worked because I had other sources of income. The other thing that Jared said was learning to bless and enable to do, and then also bless and enable to let go. There were some things at the church that they'd been doing for 1,000 years, like every church has, that were kind of killing them. They were exhausted. And for the first couple years, my job was just to give them permission. Can we do this? I'm like, yeah, do it. Yes. And there were some things that they let go. One in particular was fellowship. And I was feeling extremely, extremely guilty that we were not having a coffee hour. And lo and behold, the people who cared put their time where their priority was, and they made fellowship happen once they realized it had disappeared. So there's a little bit of freedom in allowing things to go fallow in the way that the people to whom it matters will pick up that task, and become the church and do the ministry as a church body. So those are kind of my insights from 15 hours a week.
John.
I guess I'm thinking. I'm John Helgeson. I'm kind of one of those, as been said, I'm one of those strange people. I am a retired Presbyterian minister who serves a Federated Church in Masonville, which is near Binghamton and near Oneonta, that area. And also while I was doing that, the American Baptists approached me about doing another church. So I also do the Bainbridge Baptist Church. So in effect, I'm half-time at Masonville, 1/4 time at Bainbridge, and have some very strict hours, which interestingly enough, both churches pretty much agreed upon and decided upon as soon as I became available. They pretty much knew what that meant. And this is a church that both churches have taken seriously the concept of part-time ministry, and both congregations have leadership and people who are willing to step up and do things that I just don't have the time for. And that includes pretty much almost across the board. And it's been a very helpful situation that way. I mean, I obviously I do what I can, but they also fill in very clearly, and they have no problem with asking me, John, do you mind if we do this type of thing? And I have no problem saying yes to that. But both churches have been very satisfied with the concept of part-time ministry, and it helps me because I guess I'm one of these type of people who probably will never retire, but I don't need a full-time pastorate, and I can save them money, which it obviously does. And fortunately, both churches are, as a result, they took a look at themselves financially and they realized it ain't going to work full time. So they were quite honest about that. And when they recognized that, they pretty much decided that part-time was going to work for them, and they've been working at it.
Thank you, John. And Joan Dewing, who's also teaching in our lay study program.
Hi. So I serve a very small community church who hadn't had a full-time pastor in a long time, and they are very happy to have someone who's willing to come consistently. And I think that for them, part-time is the only thing that works. And truly, as long as there's someone there to lead worship, they're very happy with that. We have started Sunday school program. We're starting a Bible study. So because I am willing to be there, there are more opportunities for growth personally in the church, as well as growth in numbers. One of the things that for me is a drawback in my situation is that I live a fair distance away from the church. And because of my other part-time job, which is the administrative assistant at the Walton First Baptist Church. That takes a lot of my time. So I cannot be there all the time. And so that's frustrating for me, is the distance that is, that keeps me from being there for events in the community. But the part-time piece for the church is great. And for me, it allows me to be involved in 2 churches also. So it's my input.
Thank you, Joan. And then out in the Chautauqua Association, Phil Pratt, you said you would like to share a word. Go ahead.
One of the things that I kind of had to train the congregation on right from the start is I don't have to do everything. You have skills, you have abilities, you have time. I think it's good for the congregation to grab things and run with them. We have a woman who's very qualified, who has taught a woman's Bible study on the book of Romans. Tremendous. And they're all afraid, gee, we don't want to step on your toes. And I'm like, you're not stepping, please go ahead. And recently we had someone who had to be driven to Erie to get a pacemaker. And someone in the congregation volunteered to do that, saying basically, you don't have time, you're busy with other things, I'll take this responsibility. And I see the people growing from this, that they realize they are part of the ministry. It's not always just the guy who stands behind the pulpit, but they each have roles, they each have abilities, they each have skills. And the more they get involved, the more they seem to grow from it. And that's really all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you, Phil. Trying to remember. We also had a couple of folks raise their hand with the little emoticons. Were you wanting to share as part-time pastors? Or did you have another question? Again, I'm not seeing everybody here, but Bill Beck, go ahead. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, let me just get unmuted. So I was curious if you could speak a little bit on, the part-time pay and part-time expectations. Do you see more success in managing that with a salary or an hourly rate? And could you expand a little bit on why?
I'm going to let my brain think on that and tag team Dr. Kelsey. Jim?
I don't mean it is. It's a good question. I've not thought a lot about it. I tend to say to churches, there's a certain base rate per hour. You figure up what the church, we figure out what the church wants the pastor to do. We want a sermon on Sunday morning worship. Okay, that's 10 hours. We have 5 shut-ins. We want them visited once a month. Okay, that's 6 hours. And to sort of build a salary based upon their expectations, I would hesitate. I don't know of any churches that pay people hourly. I would think you need to think that through, because pastors typically work more hours than the church is paying them for if they're part-time. And when when a pastor hits a threshold, you can only work 20 hours a week. When you've worked your 20 hours, what do you do when there's an additional need? Do you work 4 more hours and the next week only work 16 hours? I think if you're going to do that, you would want to do it on a monthly basis, to say we will pay you so much per hour, and we'll limit that to 80 hours per month because work doesn't come in evenly. I mean, what do other people think? That's an interesting question.
Is Diane Badger wanting to,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes. I use an hourly rate when I'm working with, I do a lot of work with churches. I don't pastor a church anymore. I work with a lot of the churches across the region, and I use an hourly rate. Right now I've been using $35, $40 an hour to help churches say, okay, we have 30,000 in compensation. What does that give us? They have no idea. They figure they're going to get 40 hours a week on that. And then when I take out 16% for retirement, that leaves them about 25,000, and you divide that out. I said, okay, you can have a pastor for this many hours a week. No more. That's what you're paying for. And it helps them really get into perspective what they can pay, what they can afford, and what they can't afford. And if they're going to be able to somehow raise that amount that they put aside for compensation or not. And some of them have been pretty shocked when they realized how little their money is going to get them in terms of hours for a pastor. But it is a starting point. I mean, I wish that we would have an hourly rate just for that reason.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is when you're quantifying the dollars and the duties, you can look at the guide we've sent you, that guide I wrote on sabbatical. Towards the back is an appendix where we have an example of a part-time covenant. You can write to us if you need it in a Word document. I think you all received it maybe as a PDF. But you can use that to kind of adjust and fill in the blank. And it's not one size fits all, because at one time, these documents that our national offices would send out, while very helpful for the time they were being sent out, now have become kind of outmoded and irrelevant to a lot of the actual churches we have. So we went through as a staff and reconfigured that to reflect what a part-time pastoral agreement would look like. And again, that will help guide. If you figure a 40-hour a week is full-time in many places, and I say in ministry, you might say 40-ish, give or take. Half-time minister might work 20-ish hours a week. And then you remember things like, well, 10 hours a week, no matter what size you're calling a pastor, full-time, quarter-time, three-quarter, half, 10 hours a week, rain or shine, are being taken up by Sunday morning purposes. It does start to make you aware that this one person can't do everything. And again, when we get into the issues of compensating that person, hopefully we're doing so with an awareness that if, different parts of the state have different economic costs of living, so it's a little tricky to say with the clarity, one size fits all in every community. But if you're a full-time pastor, pulling pension and benefits might be a total package approaching 80,000, and you have 20,000 to work with, well, maybe you divide by 4 and go, we need to live with that. We may have a quarter-time pastor and live into that. Again, the money has always been problematic because it's not really discussed. Sometimes churches even make it almost like a state secret. I think you really should be talking to candidates only after you've worked out some of that stuff internally within your committees and in your churches, so that then you can start looking for candidates who will work for what you can pay, if you want me to put it bluntly.
Now, one thing I found about money is, and this is partly from my experience at my first church, they just said, this is the package. And I said, okay. But at my second church, we negotiated. And what I learned was that if you talk in a very candid, upfront way when you go into a situation, both the church and the pastor, that makes future conversations much easier. Is to just start out. Also say to pastors, if you don't get it, go again, you're not going to get it. But to start out from day one, having a very candid conversation. about money. And then each year when budget time comes around, I think that makes it easier. If you've had that from the very beginning.
One book that we recommend is Money and Your Ministry by Margaret Marcuson. Margaret was a pastor in the Massachusetts region and is retired on the West Coast. She does some great work about talking about money in church. And I say it's probably one of the best books I have on my shelf. Going back to Alika in Michigan.
I was thinking about when you said, imagine the future you want and work for it. In the last church that I served, they had an organist who'd been there probably 60 years anyhow, who never accepted a salary. They had a church secretary who had been serving for 40 years and never accepted a salary. And so one of the things I had them consider was, what happens when this person leaves? You don't have it in your budget to be able to offer a competitive salary to hire someone in. And anymore, people aren't stepping into those positions on a voluntary basis. Offer the salary. They can turn it back as a donation to the church if they don't want to accept a salary. But it's important when you're budgeting and looking at the cost of personnel to keep thinking, what will it cost us if this person drops tomorrow or moves tomorrow? What will it cost us to replace them?
The chat box is also available if you'd like to slide a question there, so I can be aware that you would like to have a word in edgewise. One of the joys of having a good crowd tonight is I can't see everybody at once on my screen. Anyone else want to open their mic and say a word? Okay, Steve Reynolds. Okay, I heard Steve, and then who else was wanting to start talking? Dale?
Okay, you can hear me?
So Steve and then Dale. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I think, as I was hearing your presentations, and I think one of the things that I think we're talking about part-time pastoral ministry, I think the other challenge that we're facing, of course, the aging of our congregations. And one of the challenges that I'm seeing now is a lot of our churches are like basketball teams with no bench, and 3 members have fouled out. And so, I think that's a whole other piece to this. And especially, I think if you get talking in the future about shared pastorates, let's say a pastor were to take 2 churches. I know in our own congregation I attend now, we have a serious shortage. We have 15 people coming. We have a serious shortage of leadership that can actually, we had a situation where our treasurer, one person was out of town. The treasurer was 84 years old and ended up in the hospital. So checks didn't get taken care of for like a month. Those kinds of things. I think that's a whole other piece to all of this. We're talking about pastoral end of things, but I think we're also dealing with just the operation, the daily operation of the church. And again, Jared, you alluded to that with facilities, with all the stuff that just basically running the place organizationally. So that's a whole other piece to all this. That's probably another seminar, but I think that's one of the things that I know we're struggling with right now as well.
Dale, before you, I'll get you in just a second. I want to build on what Steve was saying. We had a church situation that's very clear about, well, what happens when the building is eating us alive. First Baptist Poughkeepsie had this massive building in downtown Poughkeepsie. It's still there. They, for many years, discussed. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Then came the time they did. And so they sold the building to another church, and they moved across town to this other church that the congregation put up for sale. And a couple of things that were immediately realized when they made that decision to move to a smaller facility. One was it fit the size of the congregation they had far better because the footprint of the church they're currently in, the entire property could fit inside what had been just the sanctuary of First Baptist Poughkeepsie. Huge. And you know, the other thing that they said is the first month they got their utility bill at the new church building, it was so much smaller. And the trustees had something else to talk about because the bill was not scary from, you know, the utility company. So they have had the last several years a very good experience being in a smaller church building. And we are certainly glad, you know, to talk with you about church buildings. That's a separate conversation. But it is, I think, still intertwined when you're calling a pastor to look at those big picture issues. In fact, I like to say sometimes the last question a church should be asking in order of importance is who's going to be our next pastor. It may very well be dealing with governance issues, downsizing the lay structure so it actually is a sustainable lay leadership structure. It could be getting the finances better in order, bringing in a CPA and bringing order to what you have. And then the building, is it eating us alive? And I think those are very valid questions to be wrestling with at any time, but especially when you're looking at big picture things like calling a new pastor. Dale LaPointe in the Adirondacks.
Thanks, Jared. My question is getting away from money. One of the big conversations we had to have with our last pastor, actually probably the last three, is the difference in the dogma. Got into a big discussion, which wasn't really easily resolved. When you talk about baptism for Baptists as opposed to baptism for somebody who's UCC. I don't know if anybody has a good answer for this.
Well, certainly something we deal with because we have Baptist, ABC UCC, ABC PCUSA, ABC UMC, ABC National Baptist, ABC Assemblies of God. We do have one church in Friendship that's ABC and Assemblies of God. And then we have ABC EIEIO. You know, we cover the ecumenical gamut as and our federated and united churches. The thing that we ask up front is if there is something like that to candidates, and I think we've gotten much more adept at some of those things, is to surface, is there going to be an issue of pastoral importance, like are you comfortable baptizing interchangeably, baptizing ecumenically? And if a pastor is not, we've already talked to the search committee about what level of comfort they would have. Many Baptist clergy will not baptize by any way other than immersion. Others do take a more, you know, ecumenical approach, especially when they're called to a church of more than one faith and order. And so those are some things that you certainly want to surface early in the process that could be, you know, very important to your congregation and its unique DNA. Are you comfortable being pastoral to all congregants, those on the differing membership roles?
Thank you.
Okay, in the chat box, Diane, you can go ahead and just give us your question since you've written it there.
Okay, how do you get a church to rewrite their bylaws based on the number of people they now have rather than the number they had when the bylaws were written?
Okay, you get this thing at the toys section in Target. It's called an Etch-a-Sketch.
That's about it, yeah.
Yeah, well, no, I mean that's the thing is we do have churches that are out, you know, they're outgunned by their bylaws.
Yeah.
And you know, church I was serving in Vermont presumed a cast of dozens in lay leadership alone. You know, they used to have, you know, 200-300 on a Sunday morning 50, 60 years ago. And so some of our experience working with churches, and you know, certainly Jim can build on this, is to talk about what sort of leadership we need and rewrite the bylaws with some sensitivity to a sustainable number of lay leaders, and also that still meets the general requirements of New York State's religious corporation laws pertaining to Baptists. Jim?
Well, I do a lot of churches talk about one board governance. which even if they don't embrace that, we talk about, you know, what are the crucial things in your church that need to be given attention? And what are all these things mentioned in your bylaws that you don't really do anymore, you don't need? But by talking about one board governance, it's not just about a bylaw structure, but it's about a whole change of culture, about what are the, I think Emily Allica talked about, we can't do all the things we used to. And so, what are we going to leave behind, and have that reflected in the bylaws? If people change their bylaws, one board structure, just because they don't have enough people to fill the positions, that's not going to go anywhere. That's not going to achieve much, because they're not going to have a changed culture. There are what I call department store churches that historically did everything for everybody. You're 80 years old, you're 5 years old, you're a family with 3 young children, teenagers, this church has something for you. And very few of our churches are that anymore. They are in some ways boutique churches. They meet a particular equipped to meet a particular set of needs. And my first church, that's what we discovered. We were a boutique church. People could get something at our church they couldn't get anywhere else. But there are a lot of things people were looking for that we just couldn't provide for them. But we still have this mindset of what I call the department store church. We do everything for everybody, and that's just not possible. If you email me, I have a PowerPoint presentation on one board governance and some handouts, and I'm glad to share. You can look at it and look at there's some examples of a one board governance structure and some different things. So I'm glad to share that with whoever asks. But that's sort of how I address that. And you're right, we have bylaws designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore, and churches that don't exist anymore.
Thanks, Jim. I also see a note from Rachel McGuire in the Finger Lakes. Rachel had the unique opportunity of expanding the number of ministers in her church this weekend. So also tell us about the good word.
Yeah, that's true. We just licensed one of our major leaders of our church, who's been just doing so much. And I'm definitely a big fan of trying to build the bench where we can. And I definitely hear the challenges and limitations with having people to do that with. But we were very fortunate this week to have a wonderful person that we could license as a local lay minister, and it really was exciting for the church. And she has great relationships in the broader community, so it brought some conversations and interactions with folks that aren't normally around the church. So it was terrific.
That's Cheryl Stewart, who's known to a lot of folks through, I think, ABW in the region. And yeah, we're always glad to see the ministry and local churches multiply. And again, it's a way of recognizing the giftedness of people. We are a tradition that calls ourselves a priesthood of all believers. We just need to start believing it. So other questions that might remain this evening? We're coming up on about an hour of time tonight. Well, let me just say in conclusion that, we're hopeful you'll join us next Thursday evening, February 8th at 7 p.m. You can use these same login credentials. You are free to invite others to join. Just share the login information and especially the resources. Jim suggested you could get some PowerPoint and some notes about one board governance, and I've placed his region email in the chat box in case you do not have it. One of the chief ways we function as region staff is to be in a support role to your church. And so please ring our phones. Please ask us questions. We're here to be in support of you. And so we're very glad that this is evidently a very good response for this program and this series. And we're hopeful that more will join us as each week goes on. This will be, again, available shortly through our YouTube channel, and you can also share that with your lay leaders. One of the best things about continuing education conferences is not just sending your pastor to something. It could be sending more than one person from your church to events like this. So you have more people then to talk about and help multiply the learnings and the applications of this type of training in the life of your congregation. We also encourage you to invite us to come to your church and talk about these things. We're here for you. So as we conclude tonight, may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Thank you for participating in this important conversation tonight.